Sporting Journal Radio, presented by OnX.
Everybody, I'm Brett Amundsen. Thanks for tuning in on this station right here by downloading the podcast wherever you get your favorite podcast or by listening on demand at sportingjournalradio.com. Maybe you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook or Rumble. We're on Rumble now. You can go all the places that you can watch and listen to the show. Thank you very much. Smash that like button or the subscribe button or follow, whatever button you have in front of you. Hit it and tell people to watch this because we got a great show for you. We actually have an in-studio guests, ladies and gentlemen, at home. Normally in the home studio, we don't have in-studio guests, but today we do. We have a special guest, and we're going to talk waterfowl. So we've got a couple of guys that have spent their lives pretty much in the waterfowl world and the outdoor world, and we're going to get their opinions on the state of waterfowling right now. What kind of season we've had so far, just overall what's going on as a trend in the duck and goose hunting world right now, and just kind of pick their brains and have them give us their favorite spots of trying to find where the ducks are right now. Maybe. We'll see what we can get. So first, in studio with us, Tom Landwehr, ladies and gentlemen. That's our in-studio crowd. Crowd goes well. There we go, right there. Tom, thanks for being with us. I appreciate
it. Thanks, everybody. Yep, good to see you all.
Yeah, and then via the software and the webcam, John Devney from Delta Waterfowl. John, how are you doing?
Good. Glad to be on with you guys.
Thanks for doing it. We appreciate it. So first of all, John, you're over in Bismarck. How have things been in North Dakota so far?
You know, it's interesting, Brent. It's, we started off so incredibly dry, right? Just terrible drought. Actually, 2 years of drought. We didn't feel like we were in a drought last year just because 2019 was so dry. But obviously, most of your listeners are aware how dry we were here and in South Dakota and across Prairie, Canada. And we went into the season real warm and real dry. And, just here in the last little bit, I think over the last 10 days, we've had a little more than 5 inches of rain here in Bismarck. And, it's finally started to feel like fall. So birds are moving a little bit and, giving us hope for the next little stretch of the duck season.
You brought up the drought, and that was something I wanted to ask both you guys because we had a pretty interesting experience on opener here in Minnesota, September 25th, and we hunt pretty much right on that line of where the south zone and the central zone kind of meet. So we're not quite in the southern zone, but we're real close to it. So pretty much the southern portion of Minnesota, and we shot white-fronted geese on opener in Minnesota. And it seems lately, the last few years, we've seen more and more specs here in western Minnesota, but generally not for a couple of weeks into the season. And then Dan, who is hunting up more in central Minnesota on opener, shot mostly green-winged teal. So, of course, some people will probably say that's due to the early teal season. Maybe it pushed all the early teal out. I don't subscribe to that theory. My theory is, and I want to ask you guys this, is with the drought conditions that we've had, whether up north birds weren't finding water or the crops didn't grow very well, there wasn't a lot of food, it started an early migration. And that's been my working theory on this.
Well, I'll let John weigh in on it too, Brett, but I'm going to go back a little bit in history and recall the 90s. In 1986, we had like some of the lowest duck populations ever, but the 90s, we continued that trend of a drought in the Dakotas. It was very, very dry in the Dakotas, and yet in Minnesota, we had really exceptional hunting. And I remember sitting on Artichoke Lake, where Artichoke Lake is, end of the season, and just having ducks all over the place. And we had a 3-bird limit. I got my 3 bluebills in like 15 minutes. And I think it was very clearly because the Dakotas were so dry, the birds moved into Minnesota because there's more permanent water here. I think that was a longer term trend. We had very, very good hunting in Minnesota in the 90s, even into early 2000s. But then as the Dakotas got wet and the prairie potholes started coming back and the habitat there was so good and there's so much of it, I think we saw kind of a westward shift. So I don't know that you can track year-to-year changes to that same kind of an effect. But I think the Dakotas were so dry that frankly I wouldn't be at all surprised to see some of that migration lapping into Minnesota.
Sure. Well, I think we saw that a couple of years ago. I remember hunting in South Dakota. We finally said we got to go hunt South Dakota, and we applied for the lottery for a license over there, got a 3-day license. And while we were struggling to shoot birds, there were some birds over there, but we were struggling to find them. All our friends back home were shooting limits of mallards every day. Yeah. And Lac Parle had loaded up with the most mallards I think they'd ever seen. Yeah. And that was because it was so dry in the Dakotas. So yeah. I can see that. So, John, I mean, you were real dry. What are the potholes looking like in North Dakota after all this rain that we've gotten?
You know, you don't bounce back from a drought out of a couple rains, right? But it was interesting. I was up in Manitoba last week, got back on the backside of those rains and went just for a quick drive close to home. And, you know, I saw ducks in skinny water where there hadn't been water in a long time. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the thing about ducks is they have this incredible ability to anticipate those events and then take advantage of them, right? I mean, I don't know what it is about a duck, but, you know, you hear guys in Arkansas talk about the ducks always being on the rising edge.
There's some there right now.
Yeah, exactly. The rising edge of floodwaters in places like the White River. And those ducks will exploit those resources so quickly. And, you know, going back to Tom's point in your sort of observation about blue wings, you know, I had the pleasure of taking my daughter out for the youth day here that I think was the 16th. I think that's right. And, you know, I wouldn't say we were loaded with blue wings the way we normally would like to be loaded with blue wings. On opening day, I saw one blue wing. He landed in the decoys sort of pre-shooting hours while I was just watching the marsh come alive. And saw what you did and saw lots of green wings. Now, this is a long way from science, but what I've seen living out here for 23 years now is when we have dry years, boy, we just don't hold our blue wings. They get going pretty quick. And so, you know, I'm sure Minnesota probably saw the same thing, is that with, you know, blue wings like a specific kind of habitat, and when it's not around, they're happy to move along further down the pike.
Do you think Tom, maybe I'll ask you this question. Do you think what we're seeing this year could affect bag limits and you know, season lengths and things like that down the line? Somebody, you know how people get on Facebook these days. Somebody was talking about, hey, we're looking at a 40-day season next year. It's going to happen 40 days, and which, yeah, I kind of said the same thing. But what would it take for that type of scenario to happen, where they'd say, gosh, we got to shorten things up, we got to reduce bag limits? What's the threshold there, you think?
Well, John is more involved now with the sort of year-to-year regulatory framework, but we're operating under a federal framework that sets season lengths and limits based on waterfowl breeding conditions, and we've been in a liberal framework for many years now, and it would take a dramatic decline to shift out of that adaptive harvest management category into something more moderate, which would bring us to a more conservative season. So I don't see that happening until you get into a multi-year drought situation in a prairie pothole region, which to John's point, I think we probably are seeing the end of that.
Well, I've kind of wanted to see more days, of course, which I think a lot of duck hunters will always like to have more opportunities, whether it's great science or not. But we seem fairly conservative in the central flyway, or the Mississippi flyway, compared to some of the other flyways for whatever reasons. But I've probably discussed this with both you guys, going back to that early teal season. Minnesota, first time we've had it since 62 or whatever it was, 63. What are your thoughts now that it's happened? I'll tell you my experience. We went out and hunted every day during the early teal season. It was 5 days at the beginning of September. We had chances at blue-winged teal, but when they were flying, if we didn't have 100% identification on them, we didn't shoot. And it wasn't until they got past us a few times that we said, oh gosh, those were blue wings. Unless they landed and swam into the decoys. That was the easy way to identify them. So we goose hunted. Oh, sure. We pretty much just hunted geese, but we had a spinner out there, and if teal came around, whatever, we could identify it probably. So we shot a couple of teal, but we mainly goose hunted. What did you hear from the Minnesota side here? What have you heard from hunters from their experience, and looking now a month into the season, are people happy that we had that early teal season?
I actually didn't take part in it. We're moving and all kinds of other reasons I didn't get to take part in it. I know people who did, and the challenge always in Minnesota is that we are a production state and a migration state, and so we have a lot of ducks here, a lot of brown ducks in September. And it always cracks me up when you go to buy blue-winged teal decoys, because they'll sell you a Drake decoy with a big white crescent on its head. And it's like, we never see a white crescent on a blue-wing in Minnesota, And it's not. It's more typical that most of the ducks you see on opening day in Minnesota are brown ducks, and so it is very much of a challenge to identify ducks, especially early morning. Typically you're facing southwest or southeast rather. The sun's coming up, you're seeing black shadows, and how are you going to identify a duck flying at 30 miles an hour? So, that's always been a concern. Minnesota's always been a very conservative state in terms of waterfowl harvest, because we've always had such a big impact. I think, one of the realities that we're facing now is we have half the hunters that we did, say, 40 years ago. We're down to 70,000, 80,000 hunters. We had 140,000 duck hunters at one point in time. We had some of the highest harvests of any of the states in the country, and so we arguably we should have been very conservative, because we could make a big impact on the harvest. I think part of our consciousness now is that we don't have that impact. We don't have that number of hunters. We can liberalize a little bit more. We can take advantage of some of those birds that we typically don't get a big harvest on, like teal. And assuming that hunters can do a good job of duck identification, that's not going to have a long-term negative impact. What I saw from the conservation officer reports is that generally people were pretty good on their duck identification skills. And it could be in part because there's a lot of bluewing around and not a lot of other ducks flying. But I think DNR is running a test. I have not seen the results of that yet.
Oh, you haven't? Okay. I was going to ask you.
To see what the non-target take was, and if we're within some level of acceptable error, then I would expect the season will continue.
Yeah, it's a 3-year experiment, right?
Yep,
and they have spy blinds, and they're going to figure out what the rate of mistake ducks were.
Right.
And you brought up the license sales, and I want to ask you more about that. But first, before we do that, what you did in North Dakota, John, is a little bit different. You guys had bonus blue-winged teal for the first 2 weeks of the season. How did that go, and what do you hear from hunters? What are you hearing from hunters about that bag limit over there?
I think it's quite popular. I think in a state like North Dakota, where the hunting effort is probably a bit more diffuse than it is in places like Minnesota or Wisconsin or Iowa that have more recently participated in those experimental seasons, I think it'd be hard to do spy blind stuff in North Dakota, just by the nature of the habitat and the way hunters distribute. And when that offer, remember, this all came out of the conversations at the flyweight scale, where the southern states were asking for six teal in the bag, and I think the northern states were happy to go along with it if they had the opportunity to participate in the teal season in some way, shape, form, or fashion. I think North Dakota and South Dakota looked at that and thought, boy, oh boy, we don't want to go through the spy blind experiment stuff, but how about just give us 2 extra blue-winged teal for those first 16 days of the season? And in a year like this, where we don't have super abundant blue wings, I don't think probably many guys shot those bonus teal, but when we have them, the production's good and habitat conditions are good, it's awful nice to be able to have a crack at a few. From my vantage point, I'm not that terribly interested in shooting mallards and pintail and some of the other ducks in September, just because, frankly, they're pin feathery, they're scrawny. Blue wings in September are almost always nice and fat. They make for a good table fare, and so it's pretty nice to come home with, it doesn't happen a lot, but a guy can come home with 8 blue wings on the strap early in the season, and that's a great opportunity. And again, as Tom pointed out, blue-winged teal are super abundant. They're subject to really low historic and contemporary harvest rates. Probably one of the more short-lived duck species, kind of, not quite boom or bust. But, we should take advantage of them when we have them. And so I think I'm pleased with what the North Dakota and South Dakota Game and Fish did. I think it was a great solution to sort of the circumstances we have here.
So one of you guys maybe can help me out with this a little bit. If I remember correctly, it was a bonus 2 blue-wing teal or an early teal of blue or green wings, correct? Do you guys remember that? That was the option, right? Yep. Why? Do you know why it wouldn't have been 2 bonus green wing teal? Is that because you can shoot all the ducks, and if you got your ducks in hand, you can identify the green wings and blue wings better?
I'm not quite sure. I think, the teal season is primarily made for blue wings.
Right.
If you go down, if you're in Kansas in September, or you're in Texas or Louisiana in September, especially early in those seasons when most of the harvest is taking place, it's mostly blue wings.
Blue wings, yeah.
As the season goes on, you start to see more green wings creep into the bag. But, green wings get, I wouldn't say heavily harvested. They're amongst the most harvested ducks. And so I'm not quite sure what the negotiations were. In fact, I have to remind myself that they're not 2 bonus teal, they're 2 bonus blue teal.
Right.
The season every year. Because it is different. If you're in Illinois during the teal season and a green wing flies by, he's fair game. And so I'm not quite sure how it came to be, but it is what it is. And I think it's right-minded because, those seasons were primarily oriented around blue wings.
Last year, John, you had a number of duck hunters traveling to North Dakota because of COVID. They couldn't get into Saskatchewan or Manitoba. What are you seeing out there this year?
I haven't been out as much as I would like, but the reports I'm hearing is it's pretty busy. I think there's some people that still didn't want to piddle around with, crossing the international border. I guess I can understand that, although I was amazed how simple the process was when I did it last week for the first time in a long, long time. So I think it's busy, and I think it's interesting when hunters find places, where we had potentially last year some displaced hunters from Manitoba and Saskatchewan that came to North Dakota. I think probably a lot of those guys looked around and said, maybe we're going to do this for a few years. Mm-hmm. Now, the habitat conditions last year versus the habitat conditions this year, pretty different. The marshes look different, a lot of dry ponds. But, I think probably, the hunters that came out here found some success last year, probably said, well, heck, we're going to go back and do that again.
I'd be curious to hear what happens to some of those, because we definitely lost some of our sloughs when they dried up. The farmers reclaimed them, and I'm not going to fault them for that because they were probably farming them at one point, and they're trying to get some of their land back. It's just unfortunate for us duck hunters and pheasant hunters, for that matter, too, to lose some of that habitat out there. And when it comes to those license sales, go ahead, John.
We don't lose those wetlands necessarily, unless they put ditches or drain pipes in them, right? And I've been away from, Minnesota for 23 years now, but, it probably does a lot of Minnesota habitat a lot of good, frankly, to get dried out a little bit, get rid of some of that hybrid cattail. One of the ways to do that is have a farmer run a sickle bar through it. And if that stuff goes into production, but the hydrology hasn't been changed, that'll be back to good habitat in the future, where I would guarantee you that a lot of stuff had been pretty degraded over time. Tom will know this. Tom worked with a team of really dedicated, shallow lakes and small wetlands people in Minnesota. And, frankly, those resources, probably the best thing for Minnesota hunters is painful this year, but some of that habitat right now, frankly.
Well, and it's to that point, John. For the average person, when we go to wildlife management school, we learn all about the Prairie Wet Dry Cycle, and that is actually, the prairies have adapted under this irregular cycle of wet and dry. And when prairies dry out, the ponds dry out, kills the muskrats, kills the carp, kills everything that you don't want in that pothole. In cases of agricultural fields, they may get plowed up, but it will get wet again. And when it does, over a period of years, the cattails come back, the muskrats come back. It makes really prime duck habitat. And so this Prairie Wet Dry Cycle is something that's been recognized by waterfowl managers for a long time and actually appreciated. And when we talk about things like Marsh Lake, where we've now got a drawdown structure on there, that's the purpose of those drawdown structures, is to emulate that natural cycle, because we've sort of screwed up the plumbing so bad that we have to force a human intervention on it now.
That Marsh Lake project was quite a project, and it's working.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not working. Stay far, far away until next year. Obviously.
Swan Lake, right? Swan Lake's another example where, obviously, I'm sure there are a lot of frustrated guys that can't get 16-foot boat and 40-horse outboards in it.
Yep.
But, what that'll do is reset the vegetative regime, kick off, submerge aquatic vegetation, invertebrates, and it's sort of a modicum of pain now for a long-term, more resilient system, more productive.
Yep.
And when you have those projects that are successful like that, that increases more access for waterfowl hunters. And I want to ask you guys, in the trend of license sales, we're obviously seeing a reduction, and part of it, I think, is kids aren't being introduced to the outdoors as much. They don't have the tradition of their father and grandfathers maybe taking them out, or mothers or whoever. They're inside, electronics, all that whole argument. But I think the bigger argument is access. And I want to get your opinions on how waterfowling has changed. Because when you look back in the 70s and 80s and even the 90s, and even when I grew up, when I first started duck hunting and goose hunting, a lot of it was pass shooting. Mm-hmm. You don't see that as much anymore. A lot of the public grounds, like say Lac Parle, that had the state blinds, you don't see people lining up to go pass shoot one goose as it flies over anymore. Mm-hmm. You see people setting up decoy spreads and leasing land, and sometimes access is getting more and more limited. Is that becoming a bigger factor in a reduction in license sales, or is that just another contributing factor?
Well, I sure don't think so in Minnesota, Brett. I mean, we've got outstanding access in Minnesota. We've got, we say 10,000 lakes, whatever that means, but we've got 3,000 public accesses on lakes. And, for hunting, it's not the small prairie pothole that is the place where you go to hunt ducks. You go to the bigger lakes, the Swan Lakes John mentioned, Heron Lake, Marsh Lake, those big lakes that all have public accesses, and you can get on them and you can hunt. And we've got just unfettered, and you think of the 12 million acres of public land that we've got. If you want to walk into a beaver dam, you can. Up north you can shoot that and get into a wild rice lake. There's tons of wild rice lakes up north. Hunt on rivers. I mean, there's just an abundance of places to hunt. I think, at least on the Minnesota side, and it'll be different in Texas, it's probably different in North Dakota, but I think on the Minnesota side, I don't think access is really the problem at all.
You don't see those water hunters as much in North Dakota.
No, but I think, the point you make there is that that kind of hunting is expensive.
Yeah.
You got to have a boat. I remember the first time my buddies and I had a boat. It was a little plywood thing. It was an absolute casket, water casket is what it was, but we went out in it and we, paddled across a small slough on it. But, if you're going to, unfortunately we sort of foster this belief that, well, you got to have the big boat, you got to have the motor on it, you got to have, 3 dozen, full-bodied decoys with, the fanciest Texas rig on them, and you got to have, a $3,000 Benelli shotgun, you got to have 2 good dogs that, compete in trials. And, we create this notion that in order to be a real duck hunter, you got to have these things. And the first time I shot a duck, I think I was walking through the woods and a wood duck got up out of a pond and I shot it. It does not have to be that complicated. And that's, I think, one of the messages we got to convey to people is it does not have to be that complicated. And you can get out with a pair of hip boots and a shotgun and a couple of decoys and shoot ducks.
Do you think, obviously we want people to participate because we want the tradition to continue, but how important is the fundraising of those license sales? When you hear about, oh gosh, we're not selling as many licenses, especially from, say, the DNR, how much of that is magnification of the issue to make sure that they can pay people to work there, and how much of it is a dire situation that we're losing people participating in the outdoors?
Well, at least in Minnesota's case, and again, John may have other views in other states, but at least in Minnesota's case, when you look at the cost of sort of wildlife management for hunting purposes, the license sales is frankly a fairly small element of that, and I'll come back to some of the other elements. But the license sales do pay for specific activities, so you buy a duck stamp, and that can only be used for duck management purposes. Nonetheless, if we have 70,000 hunters and you're each paying $10 for a duck stamp, that's only $700,000. Sounds like a lot, but in the scheme of things, it's not. More and more, we're asking the public at large to pay for some of these things because there are great public benefits to wetlands, there are great public benefits to grasslands, there's great public benefits to the management activities that are going on. And so in Minnesota, we've got the Legacy Amendment, for instance. So that's putting $130 million a year into wildlife management. We've got the CREP program, you've got CRP, you've got these agricultural programs that are also supporting wildlife management. The hunting and fishing fees pay for hunting and fishing management activities, not so much for the habitat work, and that is where it's important. But even there, it's, some of that fee funding is coming from the general fund to cover some of those activities. Wildlife law enforcement, for instance, should not just be paid for by hunters and anglers. When warden takes on a case of somebody illegally shooting a wolf, well, why should hunters and anglers be the sole bearers of that? So we do spread the cost across society at large, but those dedicated fees, those pay for very specific wildlife management activities. They're very important. So keeping numbers up is important for that, but I would argue that it's more important for the political strength of having a hunter base.
That is important. You got to have it's strength in numbers for sure, and it's important that we continue having a way of life that we enjoy to continue into the future. And I will say this too about Minnesota. One thing, we've all done a little bit of traveling, and I've traveled to a lot of different states, and particularly a lot of the discussion revolves around the fishing side when it comes to this. Sometimes those of us that live in Minnesota, we take for granted the outdoor opportunities that we have.
Right.
And I'll talk to people that live out east or down south, and they'll say, wait a minute, y'all can just go to that lake and start fishing? Because a lot of times it's down south. And I'll say, yeah, it's a public lake, it's public water. We can, you got to buy a license or whatever, but we can go fish. Where in so many places you have to pay, these private accesses to get into these lakes. So we have amazing natural resource opportunities.
A big state like Texas, there's very little public land. Yeah. It's very hard,
So what do we need to do what do you guys think we need to do to increase participation and get license sales back up?
Well, I'll let John comment more on Delta's efforts, but Delta, I'm a board member at Delta Waterfowl, and Delta's got what's called a Hunter R3 program, recruitment, retention, reactivation, and I think really that's the key. When you look at the demographics of the hunters, there's a lot of us old white guys out there, right? And that's not a good place to be when you're thinking about the future. And so we all recognize that we got to get more women, we got to get more minorities, we got to get more young kids out there to start taking up hunting, because we all believe that people will find hunting and fishing as exciting and interesting and as a lifelong endeavor as we do, but we got to get people exposed to that. So I think, personally, I want to get new people out there, and organizationally, I think all the hunting organizations ought to be doing this, and Delta's got a really good program underway right now.
I have 2 memberships to Delta Waterfowl, actually. I just want to point that out. I should probably get that cleared up with you guys, John, but I'm getting 2 magazines every time they come out. But tell us about your R3 program a little bit.
Yeah, and it's built on this premise, right? And it started back in the early 2000s, and I think it's sort of a fascinating story because Jim Fisher, a colleague of mine, was sitting around the Delta Marsh sort of looking at the Canadian annual hunting review, which shows the annual harvest, and he was looking at the hunter numbers and thought, holy cow, it seems really small. And he sat down and looked at it and traced it over time. He's like, holy cow, we've lost 70% of our duck hunters since the 70s. he called down here and said, well, what's it like in the States? And we're like, oh, we don't have any problem with hunter numbers here in the States. And, everybody's duck hunting. And, there's no problem here until we looked at the numbers and figured out, even coming out of the late 90s, we were a third below where we were in the 70s. And we didn't really hear anybody talking about it. We heard lots of people talking about the decline of lesser scaup. We heard lots of people talking about the decline of pintail and those crises, or black ducks, and we didn't hear anybody talking about duck hunting. And so, it started with, I think in 2001 with the first ever youth hunt in Canada that we worked very hard to get the statutory authority for. And then it's been building over there. And, Joel Bryce and his team have done an exceptional job of being really thoughtful about what it's actually going to take to recruit hunters. And so, we've got the youth activities that are primarily done through our chapter network around the country, and our volunteers take proceeds from their local events to get youth involved. Joel and his team are working very hard to introduce new young wildlife professionals to duck hunting through our university hunting program. And then there's this huge public policy nexus, right? And again, as a kid who grew up in Minnesota and lives in North Dakota, Brett, you mentioned it's pretty easy to get, complacent or not recognize what's around you. But, go to Pennsylvania where you can't shoot a duck on a Sunday, or North Carolina or Maryland or Virginia until relatively recently, where you don't have access and opportunity. And you go to places, let's talk about Arkansas for a second, which has got this incredible tradition and burgeoning industry around duck hunting. And, the state WMAs, frankly, are falling apart from decaying infrastructure. And when stuff gets competitive and access gets limited, the public relies on those public trust assets, and they're not being managed as well, frankly, because the agencies don't have the money to replace infrastructure, the personnel to run it. And so the public policy nexus on things like Sunday hunting, things like creating more public hunting opportunities, defending public hunting, all plays a big role that's intertwined, at least the way we see it here at Delta.
Yeah, John, you make a good point. We feel a little smug in Minnesota here with this sort of funding mix we've got for activities, and Minnesota is really an island, in that desert. There are not many states that have that kind of money going into natural resources, and we're just very, very fortunate here. But we also recognize that, especially at public policy stage at the national level, you have to have hunters in every state. You can't just have hunters in the prairie pothole states, and so it's important that we think about what we can do in these other states in order to keep hunting a viable activity for new hunters as well.
Tom, what are you doing these days?
I frankly just retired. October 1st, I retired from my most recent job, which was the executive director for the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters. And by the way, we got good news from the Biden administration on that today. I just retired October 1st. I kind of mentioned quickly to you, I'm between houses. We sold our old house on September 2nd, and the builder on our new house has run into all kinds of COVID delays. And so, well, hopefully we'll move in next week, but as a consequence, for 2 months I have been living in my travel trailer. Sometimes in fun places, sometimes in not so fun.
Well, I was going to say, some people dream about that kind of lifestyle.
Van life, it's not quite all it's cracked up to be when you have to be in the cities.
Yeah, no thanks. Well, congrats on the retirement.
Thank you.
What was the good news about the boundary waters?
So under the Obama administration, the leases for a proposed copper mine were rescinded. This proposed copper mine on the edge of the boundary waters, any pollution that comes out of this copper mine, and all copper mines pollute, would have flowed right back into the boundary waters and been very detrimental to fish, wild rice, to just the whole environment. Those leases were terminated. They were reinstated under the Trump administration. The Biden administration just now requires a big environmental study to decide whether or not that's the right place for this kind of sulfide or copper mining. And there's going to be a public comment period. There'll be a lot of information about that coming out pretty soon, but we're hopeful that the science is going to prevail and it's going to become clear, as it was in 2016, that this is no place to do a copper mine. It's going to be devastating to this, immense natural resource that we're, again, very fortunate to have here in Minnesota.
It's always a tough one because you want to give people an opportunity to have jobs and to work and support the economy and things like that, but you just have to be smart where you do things like that.
That's right. Not every place should be mined. Right. Not every place should have a nuclear reactor. Not every place, should have a gun range next to it, frankly. And that's just, part of our decision-making process is let's decide the right places to put certain things.
The Boundary Waters is a special place.
It is extraordinarily special, and I hope to spend much more time up there now in my retirement.
So you've been out as you were commissioner. Is it 4 years now? Is that
2019? February 2019.
2 years.
Yep,
2 years.
Yep.
All right. So are you? I want to ask you what you think about the last 2 years, but maybe how about we do this? Are you less stressed? Is there less stress in your life since you've not been commissioner?
Not as long as I was working, because protecting the Boundary Waters was my most recent job, and that's
pretty stressful.
Things were not going the right direction for the last 2 years of the Trump administration, frankly, and so it was very stressful, and we're working very hard to protect the Boundary Waters. Almost every job in conservation, almost every single job in conservation, if you aren't making some people upset, you are not doing your job. And so, from the time I started as a wildlife biologist back in 1981 until I retired, I knew some of the stuff I'm doing is making some people mad, and you just have to accept that if you want to truly have an impact on, making Minnesota or the United States a better place.
There's no way to please everybody.
Absolutely not.
And that when it comes to politics too, I always feel like that's the right gets the conservatives get conservation wrong a lot of times. If that makes any sense, I've never understood that. But you can be pro job and still be pro conservative and pro conservation.
And you think of the Boundary Waters. You think if you spend any time in Ely, if you spend any time on the Gunflint Trail, there are big. Not big industries, but there's a lot of businesses that are dependent on the Boundary Waters. The outfitters, the gas stations, the hotels. It is not as if keeping a wilderness means you're not having an economic impact. It just is a diffuse, as John used the word for hunting. It's a diffused sort of economic impact, but it's very sustainable. It will be there forever, and we need those places. We need wild lands. All of us hunters and anglers realize this. We need these wild lands just to regenerate our soul, and I think of those poor schleps in Iowa and Kansas who don't have wild lands, and what a big part of our life that is.
Oh, and we're very fortunate, and I don't always agree with everything that's taken place in Minnesota. It comes from management, of course. Not everybody's going to agree on everything. It's impossible to think that way, but we're very fortunate with the opportunities that we have here, and I'd like to see them continue that way. Right. You made some changes during your time as commissioner. There were some changes made to the waterfowl structure, the season splits and the 3 zones, which I thought were great. And I feel like the season really, there's always changes, but I feel like there were some, I don't want to call them major changes, but some fairly major changes taken during that time. Yep. Now, this year we've had a few more major changes. Yep. Overall, what are your thoughts on some of the changes? We talked about early teal a little bit. The spinning wing restriction was removed. The sunset closure was removed. The Canada goose bag limit was increased. They shortened the split in the south zone, which at this point, it's the central and the south is pretty much, it's almost like 2 zones now. Really, what are your thoughts on some of those changes? And do you think they'll continue that way, or should we change some other things?
Well, I think it's a mixed bag, and go back to you mentioned the changes we made back in 2012, 2013, and John was actually part of that. We convened a waterfowl input group and put out there a number of potential changes we thought could be made, because again, Minnesota had been very, very conservative for many, many years, and we thought some of those changes were overdue. For instance, we used to have a 9 o'clock opener.
Right.
Remember that? I mean, you'd sit there for 4 hours and you'd watch all the ducks fly away, and then 9 o'clock would come and there wouldn't be a duck around.
Yeah.
It's like, what was the sense of that? So we made some changes with the input of this group. There were some changes we considered that we did not make. Anytime you make a change, again, you're going to make some people happy, some people upset, and it's a real mixed bag. I think some of the changes that were made this year were some we should have made. Spinning wing decoys, that was one I thought we should have changed. We did not get the opportunity to do that. But, I'd offer on a 4 o'clock closure, there's very good science on a 4 o'clock closure, especially in a state like this where we're a production state. There was good research done on the Chippewa National Forest that showed that when you have a sunset, allow shooting till sunset, you're shooting your breeding birds. And so we kept that in place. Now, well, our offer is based on the previous observation. We have half the number of hunters today that we did back when some of those studies were done. Perhaps it's not become an issue anymore. And so if the current science suggests that you're not going to be over harvesting birds by going till sunset, we should go to sunset.
Normally we scout in the evenings anyway, so the sunset was never really a big deal for me.
This is one of those things that's kind of an urban myth that you're going to go out and you're going to get the sunset flight, right? Well, most of the ducks come in after sunset.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, just to Tom's point, I was looking at some data, and in 1999, Minnesota was killing 272,200 mallards. There were 633,700 days of field by hunters. Okay, that was in 99. Most recent estimate had Minnesota shooting 98,723,000 mallards in 263,500 days of field.
Wow.
So, so the mallard harvest is down by, I'm not a great math guy, but more than half. Duck hunter days of field are down by way more than half. And I grew up a kid in Minnesota that thought every duck was sacred and conservative bag limits and all the rest of that stuff. And we were doing it right and Louisiana was doing it wrong. I believe that stuff. I've still got my helicopter hanky by helicopters after Dennis Anderson's writing in the start or back in the papers during the duck crisis. But the fact of the matter is, I find it almost unbelievable at the current rate we're harvesting ducks in a place like Minnesota with the number of hunters and the number of hunter days of field that we're going to do anything bad to duck populations. Frankly, I don't think we can do it at the U.S. scale because we see the same trends that we see in Minnesota at the Mississippi and Central Flyway scales as well. Is we just don't have, I think people are perceiving that we still have the guns in the field that we did in the 70s. In a lot of ways, I wish we did, but we don't. And so hunters' ability to sort of harm waterfowl populations at this point, I think is very significantly muted.
And Judd, you mentioned Canada earlier. I don't know the specific numbers, but I think Canada's lost 80% of its waterfowl hunters.
Yeah, it's down over 70%. And if you look, if you look in 1974, just that year stands out because both Saskatchewan and Alberta shot more mallards in 1974 than Arkansas did. And I mean, that's just not happening. Yeah, there are American hunters that go up and pound the hell out of ducks for 3 or 4 days here and there. But you can't replace an army of farm kids with 870s. I mean, you just can't. And so, Canada's harvest, I'm hearing from hunters in the South that, you guys are killing all the ducks and you're killing all the baby ducks. Well, I mean, that's a nice story. And yeah, I know you saw a video of Rich and Tone up there having a great shoot in Saskatchewan, but the real numbers tell you Prairie Canada and including North Dakota, we're shooting way over ducks in the 70s, and it ain't even close.
Well, that discussion could be about more food on the ground. I mean, they talk about short stopping and all that, and Eastern Arkansas is having some issues, and so there's a lot of factors at play, I think, when it comes to if there's actually an impact on what's going on down there. I don't obviously we're not shooting all the ducks up here. I want to shift gears for just 1 second because I want to go back to something we were talking about earlier, and that's actually we're still kind of talking about, but hunter numbers and the impacts that we're having. When you talk about it being the political force, the power in numbers, and why it's important to have more duck hunters. Give us the doomsday scenario. What do you guys think? If we continue to shrink, what does the future look like of waterfowling?
Well, I'll weigh in here, Tom. I mean, Minnesota hunters have benefited immensely, as have hunters everywhere, from something like the Conservation Reserve Program or the CREP program, and which is a derivative of the Conservation Reserve Program. Well, I got news for you. I know who's working on those programs in Washington, D.C., and I know who's writing letters to legislators on those programs in Washington, D.C., and they're DU members, they're Pheasants Forever members, and they're Delta members. And when you lose those people to care about those things are not going to be important anymore. I don't think a soccer mom in Eden Prairie cares about CRP the same way a pheasant hunter from Chaska that wants to go out to Stevens County and shoot pheasant studs. I don't believe it. And Tom's right. These habitat programs provide a diversity of benefits to the public at large, but from my perspective, the public at large rarely does anything. So it's always going to be the sportsman, sportswoman conservationist that is going to champion the important issues that these resources face. And so as we lose duck hunters and pheasant hunters and other sorts of hunters, we lose the voices that move the public policy needle. That's from a guy who's been working on this stuff for 23 years. I've been hearing fairy tales about the public at large willing to engage in these issues for years, and I know who's at the meetings and I know who's not. Yeah. So that may be a little binary, and I may be a little grumpy because I paddled too far and too few ducks yesterday. That's my story to it.
Well, John, I think one of the important points that you make is that the bugaboo here is not necessarily anti-hunters. Certainly, that's always an issue, but CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, when you go back to 1979, 1980, right before CRP was created, there were agricultural programs that were intended to take land out of production. It was help me out, John, APR or conservation.
There was Soil Bank back in the 60s.
Soil Bank, and there was an annual program. I want to say it was ARP or APR or something like that. But it was you were, as a landowner, you were allowed to set aside your land for 3 years, and then you got a deficiency payment as a result of that. And actually, some of the research came out of Minnesota. Al Berner out of Medelia did some of this research. What he did is he looked at the production of game birds, pheasants and ducks, on those kinds of acres. And ACP, that's what it was, Ag Conservation Program. What was happening as a result of that short-term habitat. And what he found was that it was actually detrimental to have that 3-year program because those birds would get used to nesting in this area. They come in and they nest, and then the next year they'd be mowed up or the habitat would be gone. And so you did not get any long-term benefit from ACP. And so it incentivized the Fish and Wildlife Service to create what they called the Mid-Continent Project. You maybe remember that, John, where they were looking at how do we use private lands, because most ducks come off of private lands, how do we use private lands to maximize duck production? And out of that grew Conservation Reserve Program and the Wetland Reserve Program. But they would not have been passed through Congress if somebody wasn't there pushing those. So you look at the 36 million acres we started with in CRP back in 1980, 81. It was the single largest conservation program ever in the United States. And from the standpoint of birds, both ducks and pheasants, the best thing that ever happened. In those kinds of agricultural discussions, who is going to be at the table every day. It's going to be Farm Bureau, it's going to be Farmers Union, it's going to be the corn growers, it's going to be the agricultural interests. But if you don't have conservationists at the table, you're missing a huge opportunity, and in fact, you could end up having lots of detriment by not being at the table. Swamp Buster, you talked about those wetlands that were dry now, they might fill up again. Swamp Buster saved millions of acres of wetlands in Minnesota and North Dakota, and without conservationists constantly pushing for that, we would lose those. And so we lose all of these public benefits, we lose that floodwater retention, we lose the pollinator habitat, we lose all of these public benefits, but it is that handful of voices that are powered by the grassroots that are making the difference.
Right.
Yeah, you do. To your point, John, you do hear about people saying, we need to do this, we need to do that, but it is these conservation organizations that are the ones actually doing the work, and the biologists with the boots on the ground actually doing it out there. And as long as they're getting funding, they can continue to do so. And with COVID happening the last couple of years, some of those conservation organizations have struggled. They've had to cancel banquets and fundraising efforts. How have things been going at Delta lately?
We came through it really pretty well. I think better than we would have anticipated when the pandemic first started. And, I think we did it right. I think we were aggressive in our response. We weren't, we knew we had to cut costs. We did it without having to do layoffs, but we did furloughs to save resources. And we worked our tail off to raise money. And what Delta did, and I think a lot of our colleagues did as well, is, we didn't spend a lot of time, sort of complaining about the pandemic. What we did is we spent a lot of time talking about what our value proposition was for duck hunters. And so, we came out of it really well, Brett. And, I think we all learned a lot about that. We had major donors step up in a big way. We had our volunteers that in places where they could hold events that frankly blew us away. I mean, we had some events in Iowa last year that were just, Iowa's one of those places that came online pretty early. Our volunteers worked their tails off and had great events. And we saw that replicated all across the country. So, I mean, if you're in the seat that I'm in full time every day, we work for these people, right? And I think it was sort of another moment to reflect on how our organization is so incredibly dependent on the goodwill of others and how important it is because of those resources. Because, people prioritized Delta waterfowl in the pandemic, and we're incredibly appreciative for that.
Do you guys think that this has given us an opportunity to find new ways to raise money for these organizations? You hear people talk about, well, gosh, I don't need to win another shotgunner. Which is just crazy talk, by the way.
I don't buy it.
That's crazy talk. But I don't need another print. I'm running out of wall space. The old fundraising banquet model of everybody gathering and having a couple of beers and winning prints and shotguns. I don't mind it. I love prints. I'll always find more wall space, or I'll donate prints to somebody else. And you can never have too many shotguns, let's be honest. But is this giving us an opportunity to find new ways to go out and engage people, to become members of your organization, and find new ways to fundraise?
I think that's before us, Brett. I tell you, after what I've seen the past months, I don't see, I hear everybody say that, but they're always saying it at the banquets. So they're going to banquets and saying they don't need another shotgun or don't need another print, but they're at the banquet. So maybe, just maybe, they're not telling the truth. Listen, there's only so many ways to raise money for these outfits. And, I think all of, Delta and a number of our colleagues have done online stuff, and that's, online auctions and that stuff. That's all well and good. But, there's something about the energy, especially in the right room at the right event. You get hunters and anglers and conservationists together, that there's, what I think is really going to save the future of hunting is not that, Delta raises a bunch of money through online auctions. It's going to be around that sort of camaraderie and partnership and brotherhood with sportsmen and conservationists, as much as it's going to be about money, frankly. And so I don't see it going away. I just don't. I think there's still a pretty incredibly high enthusiasm for it. We're starting new chapters every week around the country. You know, I don't see this becoming sort of a reformation on how nonprofits fundraise, I guess.
Well, I emceed another Bluffland Whitetails banquet earlier this year, and the place was packed.
Yeah.
And everybody was pulling out $20 bills to roll dice and spin wheels and do whatever they can. And so it was a good showing this year.
You know, I think it's fair to say that nonprofits are always looking for new ways to raise money, you know, and I think obviously Delta and DU and PF didn't originate the banquet, you know, fundraising idea. It came on later as they matured over time. But I think for many of the chapters, the banquet is the social event of the year, especially in, you know, small towns and, you know, outside the big cities. You know, you don't have a Delta fundraiser in downtown Minneapolis. You know, it's in Delano, or it's in one of the smaller towns outside of town, because that is it's how people celebrate. It's how they get together in especially rural America. So I think the fundraiser, the banquets have a place, but I think what we learned, and I was running a nonprofit during this period too, what we learned is that when people understand your mission, when they share your values, they're going to open their wallets. They're going to find a way to give you money. And if they can't go to a banquet, if they can't go to a fundraiser, they're just going to write you a check. And so I think, you know, the banquet is a nice thing to have because it gives you that chance to get together, and people really want that. But when they know what you're doing and they know that you're speaking for them, they're going to open their wallet.
Well, maybe we need more Delta waterfowl banquets in the Twin Cities.
That's right. Yeah,
and in the
absolutely.
big cities, all of them. All right, guys, well, I appreciate the time. It was an interesting talk, and I think the biggest thing that I gathered, I mean, obviously, the more license sales you get, the more money you get and that, but the power, the strength in numbers, I think, is an important point to remember when you talk about recruitment and keeping hunter numbers, whether it be duck hunters, pheasant hunters, deer hunters, whatever. But obviously, we're talking ducks today. There is strength in numbers, and the political power you have when you have a big group of people with a shared passion for anything, for conservation, for duck hunting, whatever it is. The power that amount of people can hold is pretty important for us to continue doing what we're doing and having places to do it. It's all about habitat and access and all that stuff. So, John, thanks for joining us in Bismarck.
Thank you, guys.
Hopefully next time you go paddling, you're a little more fruitful.
My outcome will be a little more productive. My back won't be as sore, and my game strap will be heavier. That's what we always hope.
Absolutely. And Tom, of course, thanks for coming into the home studio.
This is an impressive place here. I got to tell you now, and I know where all your money is going. So
it's all of these things on the wall and camera gear. Yeah, because it's not the truck I drive, and obviously. But congratulations again on retirement.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, thanks for being on the show.
All right, thanks for having us.
Take care, Brett.
Devil's Lake is legendary, and this summer has been legendary for walleyes. Don't miss out. Call Haybale Heights Campground and Resort today to book one of their modern cabins on East Bay. The cabins are furnished with a full bathroom, kitchen, and all the amenities like high-speed internet and are clean following CDC guidelines. Staying at Haybale Heights gives you full access to a private boat launch, fish cleaning station, and beach area. Learn more at haybaleheights.com. That's haybaleheights.com. Plan your trip to legendary Devil's Lake today. Sporting Journal Radio is a division of Macaba LLC. If you've got a question, comment, or story idea for us, send us an email. Go to sportingjournalradio.com. While you're there, you can learn how to advertise on the show and visit our store for hats, hoodies, coffee mugs, and more. Go to sportingjournalradio.com.